Okay. Dope. So one of the most important things that we're going to talk about when it comes to components, right, is now that we know how to define components in React, we know that it's as simple as creating a new function inside of a new file and exporting that file so we can bring it into other components. Here I have just like that simple message component that is a function, and it just is returning a div that has a message in there. One of the things that kind of gets interesting, right, is passing data from component to component. And this is one of the more important topics of React that is very interesting once you start thinking about using components. So here in this message component, I have like a simple setup going on where the component returns. This is a message from, and it puts some author, right? And it passes that author. Right now, the author is just a variable that I'm setting here inside of the component itself, and the value of this author is always the same, right? So one of the things that gets really interesting with relationship to how React components work is, like, say for instance, inside of this app, like we'll just take a look at the app.js. It's always good practice when you're looking at a new React project to take a look at the app.js first, because this is kind of the default component. So this is the component in Create React App that it renders first. So whenever I look at a React project, I always want to kind of look at the app.js to get a glimpse of what's happening. So clearly here, we have two components being imported, body and footer. Body and footer are defined in their own files inside of the components folder, and they're just sitting here. Body is kind of just a component that's just kind of just imitating like a website body for this purposes of just an example, and the footer is kind of doing the same, kind of mirroring like what a footer would look like for the website, and the website is this, not nothing crazy. But inside of the body, we're doing something interesting where we have kind of this messages, and we're seeing kind of like a couple messages pull up right there, right? And this was done to just kind of illustrate the point that each time I call that message inside of the body, I'm calling this component and rendering this information that many times, 3 times, which is why we see this is a message from Cam, this is a message from Cam, this is a message from Cam. And so while, yeah, it's great that React will allow us to make use of like the same component over and over again, right? One of the things that this actually allows us to do that is very important to understand is it also allows us to pass data into the component that we can use inside of the component as data to make specific changes to how this component will be presented, I should say. Because all of this stuff that components are returning are some JSX and just some visual elements. Everything that's the component is doing is meant to be something that's going to end up being shown onto the screen somehow for a user. So say for instance, right, I have these 3 messages, and clearly I want to keep, maybe I want to list all these different messages. But rather than have all of these messages say the same thing and have the same author, what if I want each message to be different, right? Well, currently with what we know, I know I can make one component, and maybe then I might want to make a couple different components. Maybe I want a different message component for the other message, right? But that would just get a little bit, one, just be a lot of extra code doing similar things. And when you see yourself doing code that's doing similar things over and over again, you should ask yourself, how can I make this a more elegant solution when it comes to what I know about JavaScript, what I know about React in general? And so we wouldn't want to recreate the wheel and make a new component for the message when we already have a message component. What we clearly might want to do, though, is figure out a way to make it so just like we're passing in this author as a variable, is maybe there's a way to pass this message as a variable. But I don't want to change it here, right? Because if I change this here, right? That's going to change it for all of these. That's going to change it for all of those components, right? I want to make it somehow be the case that the message will know what it should show per message. So each one will have its own different bit of data, right? And that's exactly where props in React can come in handy, right? So basically what props are, and I'm just going to put a note here, and I'm going to say this component will receive some props. Props basically are is another kind of big important React concept that relates to the data that is passed into a component from a different component that component that received it can use inside of itself. So props kind of have two steps. The first step is define the prop, and the second step is to receive and do something with the prop, right? So first step is define it, second step is receive it, right? So function components can receive props very simply, right? So where you define a prop is a really important thing to keep in mind. Props have to be defined in what we would call the parent component of whatever component is going to receive them. So if I want this component to receive some props, if I want the message to have the ability to have some data passed into it, I need to pass it into it. The only place that I can do that is in a parent component. And a parent component is basically any component that is responsible for rendering that other component. So you know a component is being rendered when you see it in this syntax, this markup syntax for JSX that you see here. This is me saying, hey, I want 3 messages to be put into the body. And then the body is saying, okay, cool, that's great. Here I'm rendering the body, right, in the app.js. So in the order of all of this, the app is the parent component of the body because it is responsible for rendering the body. And the body, right, is our parent component to our messages because this is us rendering the messages in our return. So props have to be defined in a parent component. So you have to kind of find wherever you're calling your component like this that you want to pass props to. So step 1 is to define the prop. So props are very easy to define. They're very similar to HTML-like attributes. Like in HTML, there was a number of different attributes that you might have to pass inside of an HTML tag. Well, props are similar, and we can pass them to our created components and pass some data to them. So you can define a prop by calling it anything. So long as it's being defined inside of the component, inside of the parent component like this, I can make a prop called anything. So right now, I'm trying to think, because all of these components are because I want this component to really make use of this prop in a clear way, I'm going to call it content, right? I'm going to say this message component is going to have some content. And the content is going to be, I'm going to give it some data, right? So the way you give props data in React is you set it equal to an object in JavaScript, right? So inside of the way to set a JavaScript object is the curly braces here, right? So this is just saying, hey, I'm going to set this equal to some JavaScript. Inside of the curly braces now, I can pass any JavaScript data type to this component to receive. So I could pass a number, I could pass a string, I could pass an array, I could pass another object, I could pass a bunch of stuff, right? Clearly what I want to do is I want to pass this in a string. And so I'm going to say this is a prop. This is a prop message. Cool. And I'll make it, let's just look at this like this for now, and then we'll talk about these other 2 message components in a second. So I just came up with this word content. I could very easily call it a sugar if I wanted to, but I'm not going to call it that because that makes no sense. You know what I'm saying? People would think I had a stroke while I was typing. but I'm gonna call it content because that makes more sense, right? And now that I've defined the prop, right? So this is me defining it and setting it to some data. So defining it means that I'm creating it, giving it a name, and setting it equal to some JavaScript object of data, right? The next thing is I want to receive the props. So components can receive props from components can receive props very simply by essentially making use of the props keyword as data. So one way that you'll see, especially with functional components like this, that people receive props in their child component, right, is they'll just pass the keyword props in here like this. Props is a keyword from from React that when you say that when you pass props and you put props here in the parentheses of your function, it knows that this isn't just some random variable from somewhere else. This is a very important keyword, and we can make use of the data that this is going to return, right? So to make the point, and just to also show you one more time that all of this is still JavaScript, I'm going to console log props in the message component. And I'm going to just add a string. I'm saying my props are, and then put the props. So I'm going to save this and open back up the JavaScript console. And I got 3 of those console logs. And why did I get 3? Well, I put the console log in the message component, right? So naturally, because there's 3 message components, that line is going to run 3 times, right? Because it's rendering 3 of them. So clearly the props come back and it's an object, it's a JavaScript object. And inside there's that keyword content that I had defined before. And it says, hey, this is a prop message. If I open this other component, props, I don't see anything there. And I don't see anything in the second or third one, right? Because props are optional, right? You don't need to pass props. It's not required to pass props unless you make it required to pass props, right? So this message component is just fine rendering without any recognition that it got any data. And so only the one that got content defined is going to have props there to be used. The other ones clearly don't have any prop defined. So this line of saying, hey, console log the props isn't gonna show us anything special, right? So, well, now that I know that, okay, I have this props keyword clearly has a key in there, it's an object, so clearly has a value for something called content, that's this message. So if I were to, if I want to make use of it, right, I can say, hey, instead of change this here and, and just being some random thing, I can actually put some JavaScript in here, just like we were doing before with this variable. And I can say props.content. I'm going to say, I'm going to just add a couple dashes, and I'm going to just make this a little bit easier to read for myself. So I'm going to just add some parens here, move the div, just kind of put everything in separate lines. All right, cool. It might, okay, bet. So clearly we're still rendering a message, and we're rendering it. It should show us props.content -- and then the author. And the author right now is just this variable for me. And here's what we get back. We get, this is a prop message in Cam, but we get blank and blank from Cam. Well, why is that? Well, it's the same reason that we're talking about here. There's no content defined for these other, for those other 2 messages, right? So if I were to go back here and then I say, okay, well, I know I'm going to use content to define what the message is going to show. So I need to make sure that I define it so that this message will make sense for those other 2, right? So that's just as simple as saying content and giving it something else that I want to use. So I'm going to say, wow, props are cool. And then the last one, I'm gonna say, it let me customize this data. And then when it refreshes, clearly we're getting those prop messages coming back as actual data. And we can see that also inside of these console logs now. We're getting the that content as object data for each of those components, right? And so props are really useful, right? Because the problem we had before was, oh, well, I have this just very generic message component that had everything defined the same, right? Now I can pass data into each message to make it a little bit different while reusing the basic elements that I needed to make this component its own component, right? If I want to change the author now, instead of having it just be hard coded to be me, right? I can get rid of this for now, and I can say, okay, instead of this author like this, maybe I'm going to have props.author come back, right? And if I want this to make sense, right, I can pass another prop. So you can pass as many props into a component as you want. So here I have content. So now I'm going to just add author, and I'm going to just make another string, and I'm going to say Cam. I'm going to say author. I'm going to add another string. I'm going to say Professor Cam. And then I'm going to add one more. And then I'm going to say author. And I'm going to say, put it as a string and say, oops, dang, I was just going to let me sit there and look like that. Another string. And I'm going to put, I would just put camo to famo. And I saved this, and I got a error here. What is the error? Oh, I took away one of the curly braces. Do not fret. Just look at check your work. Yeah, okay. And so when this refreshes, I got all of these messages being very customized with data coming from a parent, right? And this is what starts to make React a really, really interesting tool, right? Because we can define components to make our life easier and have multiple messages coming up, right? But each message has a very similar format. Each message has the same block of code is coming for each message, but I can pass data into this visual component that will make it more unique. Props basically allow you to define data that each component is going to use in its own in its own form. Like you could use props as visual stuff. Like clearly I'm using these props as text. I could use props, maybe the props as a function that I run. And we'll see some more examples of just more advanced props probably on Tuesday. But the idea here is that we can very easily make components that are going to separate our concerns, and we can use props to style them in, or use props to render them, I should say, in very unique ways depending on the situation. And so just want to recap too, the way that you make props in your components is you define props in the parent component. So the parent component is whichever component is responsible for rendering your component. You might be hearing me say this word render a lot, and basically rendering is the process of taking an element and putting it onto the screen. And so because this body component is returning this other component, right? The body is the parent of this component, and the body is responsible for rendering anything that's here. So when we say in the app, I want to render the body is now a child of the app component. And so when we eventually render the app in the index.js, right? right? Because here we actually call that render function. That app is saying, okay, render everything inside of this app component. Okay, that means render everything that you see inside of here, the div, the body, the footer. So the body's like, okay, render everything that I have inside of me, right? And boom, I'm rendering all of these and including these messages, which is why we would say that the body is the parent to the message. And so this is where you have to define the prop. You can clearly define props with whatever name you want. And then it can be received inside of the child by passing props, receiving props like this, and being able to then make use of the props in its own format, in its own way, whether it was to render it, whether it was to run it in a different function, whether it was to save it as an array, whatever it is, right? So props are just data. So you can use the data just like you would use variables or anything in a different sense. But yeah, so that's a little bit more on components and props and how they kind of make it useful for you while you're working with React components.